Hi, my name is Dr. Mel Schneiderman. I am Senior Vice President of New York Foundling's Vincent J. Fontana Center for Child Protection and Vice President of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. Thank you for logging in to Child Psychological Maltreatment 101. Child Psychological Maltreatment 101 is sponsored and developed by the Psychological Maltreatment Alliance. The Psychological Maltreatment Alliance is intended to be the world's primary resource on child psychological maltreatment, its nature, and how to prevent it in ways that protect and promote child well-being. The Alliance is dedicated to advancing research, policy, education, and practice worldwide. The sponsors of the Alliance include the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, New York Foundling, the Educational Psychology Department of Columbia University's Teachers College, and the International Institute for Child Rights and Development in British Columbia. Child Psychological Maltreatment 101, presented here, provides an overview of basic knowledge regarding psychological maltreatment of children as a platform for considering its relevance to legislation, regulation, policy, education, training, and practices for promoting and securing the safety and well-being of children. It ends with references that you can use to learn more about psychological maltreatment. If you are interested in using this program for educational purposes or obtaining more advanced psychological maltreatment knowledge, please contact Leslie at Leslie, Leslie, dot SCHMERLER at nyfoundling.org. Thank you very much.
The presenters today are myself, I'll be starting, and then Marla Broussard will take over, and then Stuart Hart will wrap up. So we want to begin by pointing out that we use the term psychological maltreatment as opposed to the term emotional abuse or some other term. And the reason is twofold. One, psychological maltreatment, the term, connotes a range of processes that are psychological well beyond just emotional, such as values, motivations, and thoughts. And the second reason is the term maltreatment includes both abuse and neglect. So we believe that psychological maltreatment is the best term. And we believe that this concept of psychological maltreatment, this problem, deserves our attention. It is the most pervasive and widespread of all types of violence against children. It exists in standalone forms and is embedded in and or co-occurs with all other forms of child maltreatment. And it's a major contributor to negative child development. Other reasons that psychological maltreatment deserves our attention is that it attacks, denies, and corrupts the child's need fulfillment, human relationships, and personal integrity, thereby seriously compromising the child's quality of life, and then by extension, societal quality of life. Psychological maltreatment is the least understood and least combated and least addressed form of maltreatment. And if it is left untreated, it makes prevention and correction of the other forms of child maltreatment unlikely to be successful. Therefore, psychological maltreatment's nature and impact challenges traditional interventions and encourages a transformation of child protection services towards an emphasis on child well-being, promotion, and primary prevention. All right, so at this point, as we're getting started, we'd like to invite you to think of a time when you were a child and someone in authority, a parent or a teacher, psychologically maltreated you. Many people have personally experienced one or more types of psychological maltreatment in their childhood, but didn't necessarily realize it at the time that it was psychological maltreatment. In order to help you connect to the material that I will be presenting, and to truly inspire you to change how we as a society treat children, we're asking each of you who are participating in this webinar to consider something that happened in your childhood that you now think might constitute psychological maltreatment. All right, so try to think about something that a parent or somebody else in authority did to you or said to you that was cruel or emotionally neglectful or frightening, or denied you the opportunity to develop and be your best self. All right, and that's something that maybe you want to think about as we move through the rest of the content. All right, so here's the overview of the training. First, I'm going to be talking about the forms and types of psychological maltreatment. Then Marla Broussard will be talking about risk factors, prevalence, and harm caused by psychological maltreatment. And Stuart Hart will then be talking about interventions for psychological maltreatment. Okay, so we're going to start with the forms and types of psychological maltreatment. So back in 1974, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act was passed by the federal government, and it did recognize that there was some forms of maltreatment that were emotional in nature, and that's the bolded words here. Okay, and probably many of you know that while the federal legislation of CAPTA sets the minimum standards and definitions, each state is responsible for providing its own definition of maltreatment within its civil and criminal codes. So a recent analysis of all the US state statutes definition of emotional cruelty, injury, mental injury, whatever term is used, in a recent analysis, we found that most states do mention at least some form of psychological maltreatment. However, most states define psychological maltreatment by describing the kind of harm that it causes, rather than the kinds of caregiver behaviors that can cause the harm. So from a child protection point of view, this is problematic in that the child has to already be injured to be protected from psychological maltreatment. And our position is that it's really important to understand the caregiver behaviors that do or are likely to cause psychological harm, so that prevention, intervention, and treatment don't have to wait until the child is actually harmed. All right, so we're going to be presenting a definition today that is published by the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. And the definition is: psychological maltreatment is defined as a repeated pattern or extreme incidence of caretaker behavior that thwart the child's basic psychological and developmental needs and conveys that the child is worthless, defective, damaged, unloved, unwanted, endangered, primarily useful in meeting another's needs, and or expendable. And this definition and the forms that are developed in the abstract definition that we'll be presenting here today, this is the result of a long history of accumulated research and expert opinion. However, we want to be clear, there are other definitions of psychological maltreatment. The National Incident Study has their own definition. Slephayman and Snar 2011 have a definition. And as you can see listed here, there are other researchers and clinicians using other definitions. Okay, before I jump into the specific types of psychological maltreatment, I want to identify 4 assessment issues. The first is that according to this definition, psychological maltreatment is best identified, most easily identified, as a pattern of behavior. All right, so what that means is it's going to be hard to make an observation, a one-time short observation of a parent-child relationship, and know whether psychological maltreatment is occurring. This is different than, for example, physical abuse, which if there's harm to the child, if a mark is left on the child based on a single incident of a parent's behavior, that could result in a finding of physical abuse. Likewise, regardless of the parent-child relationship, if a parent engages in certain sexual acts with the child, that is going to meet the definition of sex abuse, regardless of a pattern. But psychological maltreatment is best defined as a pattern of behavior. And what that means is that we might need a thick slice of data, multiple observation points, before we can have certainty that parenting that we're observing that might be problematic is actually psychological maltreatment. The second issue is that for some psychological maltreatment behaviors, the age or developmental level of the child is relevant. What constitutes spurning, for example, is different for children of different ages. Some behaviors are appropriate. For example, it's appropriate to put a young child in a playpen or a crib for a certain period of time. It wouldn't be appropriate to put a much older child in a playpen or a crib. Likewise, cultural context is important for understanding certain behaviors and whether they are normative parenting or psychological maltreatment. And finally, there is no bright line between poor parenting and psychological maltreatment. Context, severity, age of the child, etc., all factor in to this decision and understanding about whether parenting is psychological maltreatment. So there are 6 primary types of psychological maltreatment: spurning, terrorizing, isolating, exploiting, corrupting, denying emotional responsiveness, and mental health, and educational neglect. Okay, and so what I want to do now is give you a tour of these types of behaviors with some examples. The practice guidelines published by APSAC and the monograph include much more detailed information. And I just want to be clear that when I'm talking, I might paraphrase in order to be more clear when I'm speaking, and some words might be slightly different in the actual definition. All right, so the first type is spurning, which is generally defined as verbal and nonverbal caregiver acts that reject and degrade a child. Some examples might be having a cruel nickname for the child, like fatso or stupid head, saying I hate you to the child, looking disgusted when the child approaches, mocking the child for having normal feelings of being sad, angry, hurt, or scared, treating one child significantly worse than siblings, and even denigrating the child's loved ones, friends, family, and pet, all qualify as examples of spurning. So here's a photo of a child placed in a garbage can with a sign nearby saying, put your ugly children here. And I'm wondering what you are thinking as you see this picture, whether you think this would qualify as spurning of a child. It is likely that this child would feel unloved, worthless, etc., consistent with the definition. However, some parents demean a child or play pranks on a child in the name of having fun. Oh, I was just kidding around. Isn't this hilarious? But we want you to consider that it still could be spurning or some other form of psychological maltreatment based on the experience of the child. So the intention of the parent is important for treatment purposes, but really what we're looking at is what is the impact, what's the experience on the child. And the parent might say it's a joke, but that doesn't mean that it feels like a joke to the child. And an example of this that's recently emerged online is shaming children by posting humiliating or embarrassing pictures of them or videos of them posted by their parents, either as a form of punishment of the child or to garner social media attention for themselves. And the question for us is, what is the child's experience? All right, so here we have the baby birds opening their beaks as the parent approaches the nest. And the parent is saying, gimme, 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 mocking the children for having needs. Baby birds are hardwired to open their beaks when the parent approaches the nest. And likewise, children are hardwired to cry when they fall down or when they're scared. Some emotional expressions and needs are outside of a child's control. So if a parent experiences a child's normative expressions of fear or hunger or sadness as greedy and disgusting or shameful, the child will take that in and come to believe that there's something wrong with him. We want to point out that all parents at some point feel overwhelmed by the dependency needs of their children and feel like they want a break or feel something like, I can't stand this incessant neediness. We know that parenting is really hard and that there are no perfect parents out there. The point we want to make here is that while it's normative and understandable for parents to feel this way, it's not okay for a parent to convey to the child that his needs, especially hardwired dependency needs, are disgusting, selfish, greedy, or unacceptable to the parent. This can result in the child receiving the message that there's something fundamentally wrong with him. Right, so Disney may believe that scapegoating a child is character building, But the research shows that in general, children feel terribly demeaned if they are singled out for worse treatment than their siblings. It's hard not to take it personally if a child observes the parent being appropriate, loving, and affectionate with the other children in the family and is only harsh and demeaning towards him or her. Another example of spurning here. So some parents and courts and schools believe that publicly humiliating a child is an appropriate response to transgressions. But again, there's no evidence that this does anything other than demoralize a child. In this picture, the sign the child is holding says, "I'm a bully, honk if you hate bullies." So every time a car goes by and honks, the child will receive the message that he is hated. And so perhaps you can think of some other examples of spurning because we just showed you a few. You might have come across others. And we would also like you to consider for a moment what the obverse or opposite of spurning is. So we prefer the use of the word obverse because it means something that is as different as possible from something else. So in this case, but you could think of it as the opposite on steroids. So what would you think is the obverse of spurning? You may think of something such as a child feeling loved and cared for. You might have your own ideas. All right, so at this point, I do want to give you a trigger warning because we are moving to terrorizing, and some of these pictures might be upsetting. Feel free to look away. All right, so terrorizing is defined as caregiver behaviors that threaten to or do hurt the child or the child's loved ones. Examples might be threatening to abandon the child or expel or disown the child, allowing the child to witness the parent harming him or herself or others, purposefully frightening the child or playing mean tricks on the child, telling the child that someone will hurt them when this is not the case, or expecting perfection and rejecting the child for failing to meet that standard. All right, so obviously this is terrifying. I certainly wouldn't want to be there. Perhaps you can think of another scenario where people are more comfortable putting a crying child on the lap of someone dressed in a costume. I imagine that you're thinking about Santa Claus at the local mall where kids are forced onto Santa's lap so their parents can have a holiday picture. A recent internet poll showed that most parenting sites now are encouraging parents not to force their children to sit on Santa's lap because it can be terrifying for the child and it can break their trust with their parents. Right, so there's a Snapchat filter in which it looks like a huge tarantula is crawling across your face. And there are numerous photos and videos posted online of parents holding the camera up to their baby or very young child and using this filter. And then they post the child's terrified response online, often with humorous, comments making fun of the child. What a fool, my child thought it was real. There's another Snapchat filter. Again, parents might think this is funny, that they're playing a harmless joke on their child. You can see the words at the bottom, he got scared, and the parent is laughing so hard. The icon shows the parent laughing so hard they're crying. But to a child who doesn't understand that it's a Snapchat filter, they might actually think that their face is being transformed into this monstrous face, and it can be very terrifying. All right, so there are a shocking number of photos on the internet of babies with snakes, and many times these snakes look big enough to eat the baby. So this slide is a good example of how we need to check our biases and assumptions. If this snake is not a danger to the child and the child is not afraid, then it probably would not be an example of terrorizing. But if you walked into a home and you saw this, your heart rate might increase, you might feel afraid, you might make an assumption about what this means to the child. And so you have to constantly bring yourself back to that definition, that it's caregiver behaviors that create in the child a feeling of being endangered, unloved, etc. And as you can see from this picture, This child does not look particularly frightened at all. All right, this is an example of what was most likely intended to be a joke, but it's also quite likely that this baby had an experience of danger for being cramped into such a small space. And yet the parents are, taking a picture rather than taking their child out of the microwave. Okay, so this is probably a stock posed photo, but the point I want to make is very real, which is that the threat of an attack can be very terrifying, even if the child is never hurt. For example, there's now a trend of parents posting videos of themselves with a very young child who is refusing to eat. The parent then offers the food to a nearby stuffed animal who also refuses to eat. In other words, the parent makes it look as if the teddy bear is voluntarily shaking his head and saying, no, I don't want to eat that food. The parent then brutally punches and beats the child's stuffed animal in front of the horrified child. The parent then offers the food again to the child, who dutifully eats the food. The child never gets beaten himself, but clearly infers from watching the parent beat a non-compliant teddy bear that the child is in danger should he continue to be non-compliant. Through this experience, the child will experience himself as worthy of being hurt, in danger, and his body will likely gear up for an attack. And even if the attack never comes, the negative thoughts and impact on the stress system of the child's body will be affected. This is an excellent example of the psychological aspects of maltreatment. And by the way, if you choose to watch these videos later, I warn you, they're very disturbing. All right, perhaps you can think of other examples of terrorizing that you've experienced or know people who've experienced or have experienced professionally. In other words, you've observed this happening to other children. And we're encouraging you now to consider for a moment what the obverse, the opposite on steroids of terrorizing would be. Did you think of words like safe and comforted and secure? All right, the third type of psychological maltreatment, we've done spurning, which was the first, and terrorizing, which is the second. The third is isolating. This is defined as caregiver acts that consistently and unreasonably deny the child opportunities to interact with others. Okay. Examples are locking a child in a small space, leaving a child unattended in the crib or playpen for extended periods, okay, interfering in the child's appropriate friendships, and placing unreasonable restrictions on the child's interactions with other members of the family. Okay, so this is an example of humor here. Presumably the principal, but it could be a parent, I think it's the principal, says, and you'll stay in detention until you decide to cheer up and smile. And the joke here is that isolating a child does not generally lead to improvement in his or her mood or behavior. When parents expel a child to his or her bedroom for acting badly, for example, in a timeout, it can cause resentment and a feeling of being unwanted and unacceptable. So many parenting experts at this point do not recommend timeouts anymore, and the field, so timeouts were obviously an improvement over corporal punishment or other more extreme forms of punishment, and so they were promoted very strongly, a couple of decades ago, maybe 10, 20 years ago, but at this point, the thinking has really evolved to a more loving, nurturing response when children become dysregulated or behave in ways that are harmful to other people. And so we now have really embraced this concept of a time in, which is a way of helping a child become more regulated so that they can, learn how to behave in a more kind way towards others. All right, so this documentary called Wolfpack shows the negative effects on 7 siblings. I know there's only 6 shown here, but there was a 7th, who were never allowed out of their apartment. And the documentary is a very powerful example of how social isolation really warped their behavior. For example, they became extremely obsessed with reenacting very violent movies. However, because they had each other for social interaction, their development was not completely compromised. Unlike, for example, Jeannie. This is the book cover of a true story of a girl who was raised in total isolation. She was raised in near total darkness, alone in a closet. And there was a negative, profound impact on every aspect of her growth and development because of that experience. All right, I invite you to think about other forms of isolating that you might have experienced personally or professionally. And then to consider what the obverse might be. Maybe a feeling of connection to others, of having relationships supported and promoted for the child. All right, the next type of psychological maltreatment is exploiting corrupting. This is defined as caregiver acts that encourage the child to develop inappropriate behaviors and attitudes. So examples might be related to prostitution, having the child witness it or forcing the child to engage in it. There are examples related to pornography, watching it in front of a child, inviting the child to watch pornography, or giving pornography to the child. Or criminal activity, engaging in it in front of the child or forcing the child to engage in it. And then there's behaviors related to substance abuse and violence and truancy. All right, so this is an Indonesian 4-year-old boy who smoked two packs of cigarettes a day, and he started when he was 18 months old when his father introduced him to cigarettes. All right, there's another picture of a child obviously being exposed to alcohol. You might also notice the nudity and the child taking care of the parents. So there's multiple forms of exploiting and corrupting of the child evident in this one picture. There are numerous photos online of parents dressing their children up as sexy adults and posing them as pole dancers. This is a good example of parents sexualizing their children. And of course, this is also encouraged by advertising, the advertising industry, which often dresses up very young children, usually girls, to look sexually knowledgeable and available. So there's a sort of social norm around sexualizing children, especially females. In this photo, the parents, presumably, had dressed up the child as a condom in order to take pleasure in the idea that he doesn't know that the joke is on him. This photo appears to be, but I cannot be sure, I don't know the backstory to this picture, but it appears to be a very young child engaging in using a bong. Even if there is no illicit, unhealthy substance in this container, the child is obviously being exposed to drug paraphernalia at a very young age, which can later habituate him to the idea that using drugs is accepted and normal, obviously exploiting and corrupting his morals. All right, this is a still shot from a movie. It's an example of parentification, treating a child like a parent, in that the child is being asked to take care of the mother, who does not seem to be that interested in the child. Of course, you would not want to make a determination based on a single incident, right? That's where the concept of the pattern comes in. But this photograph is depicting a situation that, if it were a pattern, could constitute exploiting, corrupting the child, because the child has to subvert his own needs to be taken care of in order to get any attention from the mother. So the message to the child is that the child is not interesting enough or important enough to warrant the parent's love and approval unless the child is taking care of the parent's needs. By the way, I highly recommend the book and the movie from which this is a still of. It is a true story of a child who experiences multiple forms of psychological maltreatment, and it's called Running with Scissors. So here we have a scene of a child who presumably is old enough to walk, being carried around by his mother. It's important for us to consider under what circumstances would this not be an example of infantilization, a form of exploiting and corrupting. And infantilization is defined as holding back the child's development because the parent needs the child to remain a baby. For example, if the child had a disability and could not walk, perhaps this would not be infantilization. However, if there's no reason for the child to be carried around in his mother's back, and it were a pattern of the mother doing this, then it could be damaging to the child. The child could be given the message that he must subvert his own needs to feel agency and age-appropriate growth and competence because the parent needs the child to be a baby to fulfill a need of hers or a void that she has. And then the child is being given the message that he's not worthy of love and approval for who he is. And here's an example of another form of exploiting corrupting, referred to as adultification, defined as treating the child like an adult. Okay, and this could be a problem for the child if the child is not allowed to experience her unfolding development in an authentic manner. If she's being given the message, you're not loved and accepted for who you are, you have to be beautiful, you have to look like an adult in order to get love and affection and approval, then that would be psychological maltreatment. And I think a hint as to what's going on is if you look in this child's eyes, to me at least, the look on her face is terror. She does not look authentic and comfortable with this experience. All right, so it's important for us to think about what other forms or examples of exploiting corrupting we are aware of. And again, I invite you to consider the obverse, the opposite of exploiting and corrupting, which is perhaps respecting the child's needs for age-appropriate development and preventing and protecting the child from having his or her morals or development corrupted. Okay, the fifth form of psychological maltreatment is emotional unresponsiveness. This is defined as caregiver acts that ignore the child's needs for affection and attention. Okay, examples are being too busy, bored, depressed, high, self-involved to pay attention to or respond to the child, ignoring the child's pleas for help, not spending regular quality time with the child, and rarely, if ever, saying, "I love you," hugging, or praising the child. So in this cartoon, the mother's saying, yeah, I'm listening. You want me to pay you more attention, blah, blah, blah. And she's busy playing her paddle game there. And the little boy looks like he's really not doing so well. And so the point is, it's not just what we do. Sorry, let me say that again. It's not just what we say that matters, it's what we do that matters. This parent in the cartoon may say that she understands that the child needs more love and attention, but her actions convey to the child that she cannot or will not meet those needs. And notice how lost this little boy is because he cannot get his basic needs for love and affection met. And again, I invite you to consider some other examples of emotional responsiveness that you might have experienced personally or professionally, and to consider what the obverse of emotional unresponsiveness would be. And you might think of loving attention and affection for the child. And the final form of psychological maltreatment is mental health, and educational neglect. All right, so this would be defined as, or examples are, not allowing or supporting the child's needs for therapy, not allowing or supporting the child's needs for academic or educational assistance, and not allowing or supporting the child's needs for medical care. Okay, and I invite you to think about some examples that you have come across in your life, professionally, personally, and then to think about the opposite, which might involve attending to and appropriately meeting the child's needs for medical care mental health treatment, and educational support. So I wanted to end this section of the presentation with something positive. This is what we want for all children, to look into the eyes of a parent and to see themselves reflected back with love. And there's another example. Okay, so I want to go back to an idea that I mentioned earlier, which is that each of these types of psychological maltreatment can be expressed differently based on the developmental level or the age of the child. And we do have supplemental slides available, but I'm just, for now, just going to point out for the first type of psychological maltreatment, spurning, that it would look different if you were spurning an infant, or if a parent is spurning a toddler, or a school-age child, or an adolescent. So examples of spurning of an infant would be ridiculing and hostilely rejecting the child's need for a primary attachment. Whereas for a toddler, it would look like excluding the child from family activities, rejecting and mocking the child's bids for attention and affection, or denigrating the child, creating a negative self-image. Spurning of a school-age child would involve creating a negative self-image, conveying extreme disappointment and disapproval, and mocking the child's accomplishments. And spurning of an adolescent would look like refusing to accept the child's changing needs and a need for greater autonomy and self-direction, or humiliating the child regarding his or her developing physical maturity or body changes or career interests. So we do need to bear in mind that what each of these types of psychological maltreatment look like do vary based on the age and developmental level of the child. All right, so here are some takeaways from this first section. The first is that we endorse, and what we're presenting today is the Hart, Broussard, Baker, Cheel 2017 definition of psychological maltreatment, although there are others. This definition has 6 major types. Each type has many subtypes and examples. This definition identifies the caregiver behaviors, although state statutes still tend to focus on harm to the child. And all types of psychological maltreatment behaviors must be understood in the context of the child, the family, and the community.
Information, we encourage you to go to the Psychological Maltreatment Alliance website, where you will find links to the APSAC guidelines on psychological maltreatment and the APSAC monograph, which gives additional consideration to the definition and forms.
I am Marla Broussard and will be presenting the material in the next few sections. Although we never blame a child for his or her own maltreatment, there are child-level characteristics that increase the likelihood of a child being psychologically maltreated. Some of these include the developmental stage, infants, toddlers, teenage. Some can include disability. Others might include difficult temperament. Here are some examples of caregiver risk factors that make it more likely that a parent will engage in psychological maltreatment of a child. Being really young, having a psychological disorder, childhood experiences of being maltreated, no knowledge of positive parenting strategies. Here are some family level factors that increase the risk for psychological maltreatment. A large ratio of children to adults, father absence, high stress, domestic violence are some examples. Here are some community level factors that increase the risk. Low expectations and low levels of support for parenting, for childcare, for child development, for child health, well-being, or children's rights, and not having people available to periodically monitor how well children are doing. Poverty, and mandated reporters not recognizing or taking appropriate action. Because so many risk factors for psychological maltreatment are also risk factors for other types of child maltreatment, Addressing these risk factors could help improve the well-being of children on a number of different fronts. Now let's turn to protective factors for the child. The most important is being biologically intact. And that shows how important it is that mothers have good prenatal care, good nutrition, feel safe. So an intact child has good health, easy temperament, learns at a normal rate, gets along well with others at school. Here are some protective factors at the family level. Caregiving quality is really the most important. Having committed caregivers who have enough energy to invest in the child. So protective factors are competent same-sex role models, married moms, set daily routine and schedule, adequate birth spacing between children. And here are some protective factors at the community level. Safe neighborhoods, opportunities in the environment that give chances to grow, develop confidence and competence, a sense of identity and belonging. And these can include good schools, structured out-of-school time in faith and service groups, sports, music, etc. Some of the evidence of harm caused by psychological maltreatment is from the ACE study and its offshoots and replications. Back in the mid-1990s, the Center for Disease Control teamed up with Kaiser Permanente in California to document the long-term effects of various negative childhood events. The original ACE study had roughly 7,000 individuals who reported on 7 negative childhood events, including emotional abuse. And in the original study, this slide shows the 2 questions that were used in the study. And we would consider witnessing mother battering a form of psychological abuse. And then the other forms of adverse events that they looked at were divorce, household member with mental illness, alcoholism or drug abuse or incarceration, which often results in emotional neglect. Many of the papers written about the ACE data have demonstrated that all ACEs, especially psychological maltreatment, have strong and consistent associations with poor outcomes, including obesity, drug abuse, diabetes, personality disorders, and so forth. This slide shows the main findings associated with the ACE studies, where the ACEs are associated with numerous physical and mental health outcomes. All of the ACEs increase risk. The more ACEs, the more risk, particularly if you have 4 or more. What we have learned from the ACE and other studies is that all forms of child maltreatment are associated with poor outcomes for children, including psychiatric conditions. For example, child maltreatment accounts for 59% of all depressive and anxiety conditions worldwide. Some researchers think child maltreatment has non-specific effects, that it doesn't matter what type of maltreatment one experiences, the harm is the same. But many studies show unique effects for each type of maltreatment. In other words, even though each form may increase risk, some forms increase risk much more. What are the unique effects for psychological maltreatment? They fall into 5 broad categories: depression, suicidality, conduct disorders, thought problems, cognitive decline in infancy and low cognitive functioning, and physical health problems. Harm type 1 is depression and suicidality. The link between PM and depression is particularly strong. For example, the ACE study found that childhood emotional abuse posed the greatest risk of the ACEs for both a lifetime history of depressive disorders and recent depressive disorders. Suicidality is more strongly linked to psychological abuse and neglect than any other of the forms of child maltreatment. So, for example, a recent meta-analysis of 15 high-quality international studies found that suicidal behavior and childhood abuse were closely linked with emotional abuse having the strongest effect among the 5 subtypes of maltreatment. Here is a clinical example. Lena, age 5, was the result of an unplanned pregnancy, and she was the recipient of her mother's verbal outbursts. Her parents' marriage had been strained for many years, and the attention required by Lena infuriated her mother. As the parents neared divorce, the mother's verbal assaults became more intense, and they included screaming at her that she was the cause of marital problems, that if she had not caused so much trouble, her parents would be happy, and that she should have been aborted. Lena stopped playing with other children in kindergarten. She was repeatedly observed by her teacher to enact the death of a baby doll, saying, "Everything would be fine if you were never born." Harm type 2 is conduct disorders. Psychological abuse combined with physical abuse is a common pattern linked to the development of conduct disorders. Together, they elevate the risk for getting into trouble with the law and other antisocial problems, like being the perpetrator of dating violence and substance abuse and other sexually risky behaviors. Here is an example of conduct disorder. At age 2, Sonny Jr. was accused by his mother of physically abusing his passive 5-year-old brother when Child Protective Services came to investigate the brother's bruises. The worker observed mother's encouragement of Sonny's bullying and hitting his older brother. She threatened to break Sonny Jr.'s finger. She also ordered him to go into the kitchen to get juice and a plate of cookies for her guest. And she commented that he helped her with housework because he realized it was too much for her to do alone. She also harshly denied his bid for affection and dependence when he tried to crawl into her lap, saying, "Don't be a baby." Sonny Jr.'s play was disorganized and destructive, consisting of banging and throwing toys in a frenzied fashion with all human and animal figures missing limbs and heads. Sonny Jr.'s father was an alcoholic with alcohol-related seizures. He and Sonny's mother had a mutually psychologically and physically aggressive relationship, and Dad had thrown the refrigerator down 4 stories because the family was out of beer. Because of a felony conviction, he was imprisoned by the time Sonny was age 4. Sonny Jr. entered and remained in special education for emotional and behavioral disturbance with poor attendance and many school suspensions for aggressive behavior from age 3 until he was convicted of a felony for violent assault at age 14. Harm type 3 are thinking problems, such as dissociation, hallucinations, and diagnosed psychosis. Many studies find that psychological maltreatment is the strongest child maltreatment predictor of thought problems. And many experts consider these behaviors part of the trauma response to maltreatment. Here's a clinical example of psychological maltreatment and thought problems. So Bernard's family is fairly verbally and physically violent. He was not often the direct target of his parents' anger. His older brother was, but he felt scared at home and stayed away as much as possible. At night, he had trouble sleeping and had nightmares. And during the day, he kept hearing someone angrily calling his name when no one else was around, and a voice in his head told him how bad, crazy, and worthless he was. He wondered if he was losing his mind. The 4th harm type are declines in intelligence and low cognitive functioning. The Minnesota longitudinal study of risk and adaptation used frequent home and laboratory observational methods from infancy on to classify forms of maltreatment in families that they are still following since the 1970s. At 18 months of age, children with psychologically unavailable mothers showed a significant decline on the Bayley scales of infant development, from an average at 12 months level of functioning to well below average at 18 months. Typical of low cognitive functioning is a 1958 British birth cohort study of about 9,000 kids. Psychological and physical neglect in childhood significantly predicted low cognitive functioning in math, reading, and IQ scores. At age 82, they predicted educational qualifications, like how far you'd gone in school and what certifications you'd gotten. And at age 50, they predicted memory and processing speed scores. The researchers controlled for a long list of covariates, including mental health and other health problems, poverty, etc., that could explain levels of cognitive functioning. Psychological abuse was not related to cognitive functioning at all, and physical, sexual, and witnessing domestic violence were not related after there were controls for other confounding factors. But psychological and physical neglect continued to predict cognitive functioning across the lifespan. Here is a clinical example of cognitive decline. Baby Jose was fed and changed on a regular schedule, but his mother rarely interacted with him. When she did, she changed him or bathed him without any expression of affection. There was no cuddling even during feeding, little talking, no eye contact. A developmental evaluation at age 12 months found him on track, but by 18 months he had made little progress and was now well below average in language and social responsiveness. He was easily frustrated and inattentive and didn't cooperate with adults. He was referred to early intervention services. The fifth area of impact of psychological maltreatment is physical health and development. Some of the findings in this area tying PM to physical health problems are striking. Our favorite, because it is so unexpected, is the Japan Environment and Children Study, a nationwide population-based birth cohort study designed to determine environmental factors during and after pregnancy that affect the development, health, or well-being of children. The researchers controlled for 16 things that might be related to hearing loss, such as noisy environments, smoking during pregnancy, etc. And they examined the 80,000 mother-infant pairs in their sample. They found that verbal abuse of mother by her partner during pregnancy was significantly associated with a hearing referral for the infant after 2 failed hearing screenings in the first week of life. Physical abuse of the mother by the partner was not related to a hearing referral. The authors concluded that a loud, non-maternal voice experienced in conjunction with maternal rapid heartbeat likely creates an environment that is uncomfortable for fetuses and therefore may negatively affect auditory functional development in the child during gestation and after birth. The relation of psychological abuse to asthma is well known. The relationship to a deficit in adult height is not. There are 5 big ideas with respect to harm. The research is high quality and extensive. Psychological maltreatment has been associated with poor outcomes in 5 domains. Poor outcomes are both in the short run and over the child's lifespan. One way to conceptualize psychological maltreatment is as an adverse childhood experience. And despite the research, psychological maltreatment is not treated with the gravity that it deserves, and it should be. Now we turn to the issue of when does poor parenting cross the line into psychological maltreatment, and need to be reported to Child Protective Services. We know from research what psychological maltreatment caregiver behavior consists of. But many jurisdictions require evidence of harm in order to screen in a case. To report psychological maltreatment, one must know what psychological behavior consists of. One must know the law in one's jurisdiction, and if their law requires harm, what harm might look like. Then, if you have a reasonable suspicion of psychological maltreatment, it should be reported. In a recent article analyzing US state statutes regarding the definitions of psychological maltreatment, we learned that few states define psychological maltreatment using parental behaviors. Most do not. Delaware is one of the few. So they define emotional abuse as threats to inflict undue physical and emotional harm and or chronic or recurring incidents of ridiculing, demeaning, making derogatory marks or cursing. And emotional neglect would be failing to provide care necessary for the child's emotional, physical, or mental health or safety and general well-being. Most states define psychological maltreatment by the harm that was done. And the harm in many states can be from any form of abuse and neglect. Here are examples from Maine and Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania labels it serious mental injury. And the definition is a psychological condition that renders a child chronically and severely anxious, agitated, depressed, socially withdrawn, psychotic, or in reasonable fear that the child's life or safety is threatened, or seriously interferes with a child's ability to accomplish age-appropriate developmental and social tasks. We want to emphasize the point that children should be protected before harm has been done, if at all possible. If there's a solid research base tying psychological behaviors to harm, and there is, then we should intervene before a child has a major mental illness or a developmental delay. For current practice, regardless of where you practice, we recommend the use of an assessment framework that we developed for the APSAC guidelines on psychological maltreatment. In the guidelines, there are worksheets that lay out each type of psychological maltreatment and places to put evidence in support or against that form of maltreatment. One of the worksheets lays out individual, family, and community risk factors and supports. And one worksheet allows you to lay out each type of harm. There are places to put evidence and then summarize the evidence. Here is a short example from the guidelines of a 10-year-old boy. The school filed a report based on a family drawing that was done as part of an interview for a triennial evaluation for special education. The boy drew himself as a bug with his father screaming at him, quote, "I will crush you, you little cockroach," unquote. Upon questioning about the family drawing, the boy reported that his dad screams at him and his two younger brothers, calls them names like dummy, idiot, and loser all the time. The teacher reports that he is very tense at school and flinches if touched on his shoulder unexpectedly. Gathering information on this case did not require a mental health professional, in part because of the extensive school records and access to professionals with knowledge of the case. Spurning, terrorizing, and emotional responsiveness were all identified. Spurning fell in the form of both the mother and the father and the boy reporting that the father frequently used degrading language to the boy and his brothers, and that he singled them out for markedly worse treatment than their sisters. He blamed the boys for their poor treatment. Under terrorizing, the mother's realistic threats of committing suicide. She had previously attempted. She was currently depressed. She'd been seeing a psychiatrist for years. And the father's scary behavior with many guns, open conflict with a neighbor, placing boulders around the house in case somebody tried to attack the house with a car, and the use of camera and recorders all throughout the house to monitor what everyone was doing was terrorizing to the boy and other family members. Under emotional responsiveness, the father was never emotionally responsive or affectionate to the boys, but he was to the girls. The mother was only emotionally responsive to the boy when he was so sick that he might die from an asthma attack, and then she became affectionate. Risk factors are important to assess because they inform threat assessment and treatment. This family had a high caregiving burden, parental mental illness, and maltreatment histories, and they were very isolated. However, they also had assets. Both parents wanted to be better parents, they were intelligent, they had financial stability, and they lived in a well-resourced community. Finally, evidence of harm was obtained from school records and interviews with the family, school personnel, and the asthma doctor. This is an interesting case. Educationally, the boy was 2 years behind grade level, even though he had average ability and had previously learned material, and then he could not recall it and use it in the classroom. He was attending a very good school system. The school provided a lot of special education services to address learning, mood, and behavior issues. Nonetheless, he had depressed mood, thoughts of suicide, a negative cognitive style, very low self-esteem, and low motivation that were impairing of his ability to function at school, that were very well documented in his repeated evaluations by the school psychologist and the notes of the school social worker who was seeing him for therapy. He also had severe asthma despite access to good medical care. His rate of hospitalizations at 3 times per year indicated that home management protocols were not being followed, according to the interview with the ENT. This case is interesting because this boy at the age of 19 killed 7 people in cold blood in a fast food restaurant that his co-murderer had been working in. He wasn't caught until 9 years later when a girlfriend told the police on them. Takeaways from this section are that you need to know what caregiver behaviors are psychological maltreatment. They have been identified in the research literature as behaviors that are related to current and later non-optimal and impaired functioning. You need to know the law in your jurisdiction so that you will know if behavior that you observe reaches the level of reasonable suspicion. And you can use the APSAC guideline worksheets to organize and conceptualize cases for reporting and for prevention and treatment.
I'm Stuart Hart. I'm pleased to be able to provide this section of the program. Now let's focus more strongly on intervention, a term we use for a broad array of efforts to improve the quality of life for children, to protect them from the dangerous effects of psychological maltreatment, and to promote their well-being. This is truly the so what section of the program, asking the question, what will you do with what you've learned? We encourage you to think about what you can do in your life, professionally and personally, to advance the cause of protecting children from psychological maltreatment. At the end of this section, we'll encourage you to identify goals and paths you might pursue. As noted earlier, there is reason for us to be dissatisfied with how society treats psychological maltreatment. This is partly because, despite being widespread, it is often misunderstood. Because it is so destructive, as established in the last section, and it can occur both alone and in combination with every other form of child maltreatment. All efforts to prevent and treat child maltreatment should include consideration of psychological maltreatment. Presently, this doesn't happen. There are a myriad of strategies which can be helpful in psychological maltreatment interventions, some highly dependent on context and related conditions. However, fortunately, some strategies that can help are capable of helping regardless of the specific situation or its context. And in this regard, they're fundamental, cross-cutting, and highly unlikely to create problems or make things worse. Here are 9 such orientations and strategies to which we'll give some attention here. And they embody a high level of mutual support and possibilities for combination and integration. Number 1, prioritizing respectful, supportive communication. 2, reflective thinking to guide interpersonal behavior. 3, empathy and compassion to guide all interpersonal behavior. Number 4, positive opening, soft starts to launch conversation. Number 5, Gottman's magic ratio for positive communication and relationships. Number 6, an assets approaches, strengths approaches to promote good parenting. 7, positive parenting basics supported by evidence and expert opinion. Number 8, positive social behaviors, the obverse of psychological maltreatment, ways and habits to counteract and replace psychological maltreatment. And number 9, relational interventions. One useful way to orient to psychological maltreatment is to recognize that in general, it is almost always a form of interpersonal communication that expresses rejection and destructive criticism of the child. Here are some examples of that kind of communication. You never do anything right. You're stupid, which would be spurning. Stop doing that. It won't work. You're just like your father. That would be corrupting and exploiting. Go ask someone else to help you. I've got more important things to do. That would be emotional unresponsiveness and spurning. I'll give you something to cry about if you keep whimpering. That would be terrorizing. If you were the receiver of this communication, would you respond positively? Would life improve? Most of us want to do what would make life better for others and ourselves. As a fundamental strategy to improve interpersonal behavior and its consequences, we recommend reflective processing by parents and caregivers to guide their actions. You've heard people say, stop and count to 10 when upset before acting, to cool down and make a good choice. Sometimes this is necessary. However, as a general practice, encouragement should be given to reflect as outlined here. What's the goal to be achieved? And ask yourself, should all goals and actions respect the golden rule at the heart of human rights? Am I communicating in ways that facilitate or impede progress toward the goal? How can progress toward the goal be improved through interpersonal communication? What can I or we do to increase our capacity and effectiveness in applying positive, constructive communication to achieve goals in human relationships? Empathy can be a powerful support for understanding others and what is in their best interest. It can guide compassionate interpersonal behavior toward win-win results for those involved. When you see an adult comfort a physically unhurt crying child who has fallen off a bicycle in the learning to ride stage, by describing how hard it had been for them to learn to ride and then providing guidance and support for the next try, you're observing compassion enlightened by empathy. Arguably, our evolving capacity for empathy and compassion has been the major contributor to the establishment of laws and standards for human behavior and rights. Fortunately, empathy can be learned when young, for example, through Gordon's Roots of Empathy school programs, and when older, through existing training programs. We have lots of good references, I think references you'll find useful at the end of this presentation for each section. The startup is the first thing you say when you begin to communicate with someone about a request, complaint, or issue. The way you begin a conversation, whether or not intended for intervention, can make all the difference in what happens next. A harsh startup is an attack or a criticism when the person feels immediately under assault, whereas a soft startup is a non-attacking and non-critical way and starts from a place of kindness and compassion and that seeks common ground and mutual understanding. Obviously, some harsh startups are cruel and brutal, not likely to produce good results. Learning to use soft startups can facilitate engagement and constructive conversations in just about every situation, including between service providers and those they intend to help, as well as for intimate partners and caregivers and children. In this exercise, we want you to consider how harsh startup statements can be replaced with soft startup statements. Here's an example that might happen when a child or family services caseworker is talking to a parent. How can I trust you? You never follow through when you say you will. The soft startup alternative, and you might think of others as good or better, I believe we both want the same good things for your family and child. But when we come up with a plan, then something happens, so the plan falls apart. Can we talk about what we can do to make our plans work? Here are examples of 3 harsh startups. Try to think of soft startup options for each. We'll take just a minute for you to give consideration to these. Now compare your ideas to those in the green following each harsh startup. This is where we've given an alternative that occurred to us. For the statement from parent to child, stop doing that, it won't work. You're just like your father. We suggest, let me show you another way that might get you what you want. For the intimate partner communication, which was, you just want to work all the time and never be home with us. What could be said would be, we really miss being with you. Could we talk about our schedules? And for the child services communication to a parent, which was, you're not holding your child right, you're making her cry. We might say, the child seems to be upset. Why do you think that is? We hope that your ideas were as good or better. I think we all appreciate the lift it gives us when someone mentions something we are doing that works, or some useful characteristic we have. Gottman's couples and marriage research gives strong encouragement to develop the habit of making at least 5 positive statements or expressions to every 1 negative in communicating with those we intend to have good relationships with, and to develop what he calls a positive sentiment override. The PSO components guide toward achieving an overarching positive opinion of the other person, which overrides the negative in the relationship, conveying that you value the other person while engaging in mutually supportive interactions. The magic ratio and PSA orientation are well worth attention, monitoring, and practice in interventions. Research and expert opinion recommend that in almost all problem situations, we should give priority to identifying existing relevant strengths, and building on them. Appreciative inquiry, research, and theory provide related guidance. As you look at this, the suggestion is, the encouragement is, identify strengths, assets, good ats that are pathways to good parenting. Recognize, promote, and magnify these. And you can see the benefits: empowering caregivers, increasing engagement, cooperation, and motivation, and producing constructive effort. In other words, look for the gold and make the most of it. The STEEP program, meaning Steps Toward Effective Enjoyable Parenting, a highly regarded relational intervention, uses video feedback to guide caregivers to identify, interpret, and improve their parenting behavior, emphasizing strengths. And when you're doing this, this is not about giving broad compliments, like you're such a good mom. It's about directing the parent's attention to specific important behaviors that give the baby a feeling of security, love, and respect. Here are some of STEEP's guiding principles with examples for the feedback process. So for the first one, ask, don't tell. When you're doing something with Rialto, and you get the feeling that he wants to do something different, how does he tell you that? And the next one, encourage perspective taking. How must it feel to your 3-month-old to see something she wants, but be unable to move across the room to get it, or even to tell someone that she wants it? You'll notice that these first two encourage the parents to explore their understandings of child behavior and needs, and their ability to empathize. In this last one, address broader issues. You're really good at reading your baby's cues. It's hard though, to do that day after day. Where do you get the support for yourself so that you have the energy you need? This one recognizes and magnifies and celebrates capacities and sources of support. All of the positive communication guidance given here and that which follows can be applied by a service provider or a natural environment observer, such as a coworker, neighbor, friend, or relative, to intervene empathically to support constructive caregiver behavior. David Finkelhor has found the bystander mobilization to be a promising primary prevention component. Here we use upstander to label the observer who intervenes in psychological maltreatment situations. Here's a vignette presenting such opportunities. What might you do if at the child care center you, as a staff member or another parent, observed a mother on the rush trying to remove the boots and jacket from a crying, fussing, and flopping 14-month-old son, saying in a loud, angry voice, "Stop acting like a baby. You're a big boy, so stop being a crybaby. If you don't stop right now, I'm going to lose my job." Recognizing that mom does need to leave, intervention can include some concrete help, like assisting in getting the child's boots and jacket off. Additionally, you might also say something like, to the mom, "You're trying so hard to keep your job and be on time to work, and you must feel frustrated and anxious that your baby is making it hard for you to leave." Note the use of empathy there. Or you might say to the mom about the baby, "He must love his time with you, and it has to be hard separating, especially on a stressful moment. Crying is how he tells you that he doesn't want you to leave. But once he gets settled down, he'll have a good time." Note the empathy for the mom and baby behavior, and encouragement for empathy and understanding on the part of the mom. For the third one, to the baby or young child. It's hard to say bye-bye to mom, but you're going to have lots of fun today with Jason and Anna. When she comes back, you can tell her about the train you played with and the swing. Note the empathy for the baby and encouragement for realistic appraisal and comforting for the mom. This and the next two slides provide some well-founded positive parenting principles, sub-principles, and examples of their communication. Interventions with caregivers should provide a rich context of such material and encouragement for practice and monitoring to make them a way of life. A wide range of effective positive parenting strategies have been identified which have application across settings, cultures, and times. Here are some broad principles deserving promotion and consideration. First one, promote secure attachment, which means essentially behave in safe, predictable, loving, attentive, responsible manners with the child. An expression would be if you were to touch your child in soothing and a predictable way. Respond to the child's cues and requests in a timely manner. Teach respect through being respectful, meaning take the child's feelings and needs into consideration, even when upset with the child. Could be expressed in saying, I hear that you wish you could eat ice cream for breakfast. Boy, that would be yummy. Too bad ice cream isn't a breakfast food. Be proactive, essentially meaning anticipate the child's needs and feelings in order to avoid misbehavior. You might say, we need to go to the store today. Let's plan a time when you won't be sleepy. You can help me plan what to buy. And when we get to the store, you can decide if you want to ride in the cart or walk by my side. Engage in reflective parenting, which means, at least in part, think about what kind of parent you want to be, then live it. You might, in thinking to yourself, say, I didn't like it when my parents made me feel bad for being afraid. I don't want to do that to my child. Use emotion coaching to teach self-regulation, meaning, in part, convey acceptance of feelings. You might say, I see that you're feeling angry at your brother for grabbing your toy. I don't like it when people take things from me. How could you let him know you don't like it when he does that without hitting him? Be encouraging. In part, meaning notice when your child is doing well at something. Expressed in saying, I see you working so hard to clean the counter. Promote your child's autonomy. Essentially mean give choices when applicable. Do you want broccoli or green beans with your dinner tonight? You choose. Psychological maltreatment behaviors are an attack on basic human need fulfillment and highly unlikely to produce healthy development, behavior, and well-being. Reflection on this argues for making the primary pattern of interpersonal life the obverse of psychological maltreatment. We use obverse here, which means something that is as different as possible from something else, like opposite on steroids. Related interventions can help caregivers appreciate, practice, and establish these affirming, supportive, and respectful conditions toward life habits. So the obverse of spurning, be loving, nurturing, kind, attentive. That kind of a parent who accepts the child as special and as a unique individual. For terrorizing, the obverse would be provide a safe and nurturing environment that is sensitive to the child's needs for consistency and safety. The obverse of isolating, provide for the child's needs to feel connected and belonging within the family as well as the extended family and community. Exploiting and corrupting, the obverse of that would certainly be, or those would be, honor the child's need for moral and ethical role models within the family, for promoting age-appropriate expectations towards socially responsible behavior. The obverse of emotional unresponsiveness, convey to the child through words, touch, and attitudes, emotional availability, and loving attention and affection. For medical, mental health, and educational neglect, the obverse would be ensure that the child receives necessary treatments and services. Relational interventions deserve high priority in interventions, and they offer the opportunity to incorporate all the strategies and components of this section. Truly effective interventions require that specific attention is given to the interactive relational behavior of the caregiver and the child, the meanings embedded and expressed, and their need fulfillment purposes. The relational interpersonal context is where human needs are met or thwarted, where psychologically supportive or destructive interactions occur. It is the primary context for eliminating psychological maltreatment and promoting well-being. Relational interventions have research and a high level of expert opinion support. Here are frequently applied components of relational interventions. A home visitor approach, working with parents during the early years of the child's lives. Multiple observations and consultations for play, conflict, and other interactions across months. A focus on the caregiver-child dyad with priority given to the relational nature of their behavior and interactions. Exploration and guidance regarding the child's views and needs and the caregiver's views and needs as communicated in behaviors and interactions. Guidance and understanding and reformulating representations of self, child, and caregiving. Modeling and direct support for improving the parent-child relationship in its natural context. It's important to recognize that the full social ecology, as originally conceived by Bronfenbrenner, provides intervention opportunities. At the cultural level, for example, media might promote good child caregiving and discourage psychological maltreatment. Among peers, face-to-face psychological maltreatment and cyberbullying can be depressed. And in the family, secure attachment and the obverse of psychological maltreatment can be promoted by home visitors and other enlightened persons. We need or will find great value in a framework for all interventions and relationships. Interventions to promote child safety and well-being, reduce psychological maltreatment, and increase its obverse. They need to be framed in ways that are understandable and advance mutual support and synergy. All the intervention programs and components, including those just considered in this brief presentation, can fit into one or more levels of a three-tiered approach. Tier 1, encompassing all universal well-being promotion and violence prevention efforts. Tier 2, concentration on pointed intervention for at-risk populations. Tier 3 would be focused on correction where psychological maltreatment has occurred and requires intensive targeted intervention due to the failure or insufficiency of the other tiers. The next slide places the three tiers in a pyramid with using traditional prevention language. This pyramid presentation frames the three tiers as primary prevention for the entire population as base, risk population, targeted secondary prevention as middle tier, and tertiary rescue and treatment for existing psychological maltreatment at the apex. There are many advantages to an intentional, coordinated three-tier approach. And here are some of them. It brings together all relevant sectors of society, including education, social, human services, healthcare, and law enforcement. It frames expectations and the manner in which each tier can best contribute to the common agenda. It encourages significant respect for the fact that a majority of interventions have relevance in adjusted forms at each tier and can be designed to magnify their connected benefits across all tiers. There'll be references for this section connected to these ideas that I think you'll appreciate. For Tier 1, primary prevention, work to make the world a more loving, respectful, and safe place for all children. You might promote social norms through billboards, public service announcements, community consensus, and business practices that champion good parenting and children's health, well-being, and rights. You might work to achieve secure attachment as a foundation for good human relationships and well-being throughout life. To do that, you might promote universal home visitor services for all first-time parents. You could promote living and teaching empathy, pro-social values, social cognition, and reflective caregiving to parents and future parents. This might involve you in establishing supportive programs in schools, community services, employment, faith communities, and online. You could work to respect the rights and perspectives of children in all interactions. This could mean establishing child and youth membership in school and community organizations that influence their lives. At the 2-tier level, the risk reduction. Establish social norms prohibiting psychological maltreatment. You might help communities, schools, and child services educate their publics regarding psychological maltreatment and its destructiveness. You could work to clarify the line between poor parenting and psychological maltreatment and your state's definition of actionable behaviors, and then act accordingly. This might mean establishing guidance for mandated reporters and the public regarding related distinctions. You might work to identify factors that place a family at risk for psychological maltreatment and address those factors. This could include developing and or providing parenting programs online or in person that emphasize non-stigmatizing, easy access, psychological maltreatment sensitive, strength-based approaches. You might work to identify and respond to parents at risk of engaging psychological maltreatment and provide support and resources to help them. This could mean creating or promoting parenting hotlines or soft startup, upstander behavior in your community, or the place of employment or faith community. And you might, of course, promote and apply all of the Tier 1 strategies in Tier 2 work. At the Tier 3 intervention level, you could work to include the most serious psychological malforms in all Child Protective Services standards, investigations, and determinations. That might mean that you advocate for changes in state standards. You could work to include consideration of all forms of psychological maltreatment in Child Protective Services intervention prescriptions and programs. This might mean you would help establish psychological maltreatment inclusion in data intake and in intervention planning. You could work to help parents repair relationships with their children through loving, supportive child caring. This might mean that you promote and employ relational interventions emphasizing positive, reflective parenting. You could work to ensure that all child mental health services address psychological maltreatment as an adverse childhood experience. This could mean providing education and training to child mental health service providers. And of course, you might promote and apply all Tier 1 and all Tier 2 strategies in Tier 3 works. It's important to realize that many, possibly most of these interventions have relevance at all 3 or within all 3 tiers. Some examples here. Raise and support social norms. That applies across all 3. Focus on child well-being. Promote quality relationships and relational interventions. Promote assets and strengths approaches. Promote positive parenting. Promote the obverse of psychological maltreatment. Take a public health approach. Take a human rights approach. And, among others, employ one or more supportive frameworks across all tiers. For example, the APSAC psychological maltreatment definitions, respectful, reflective, relational behavior intervention, assets and strengths approaches, community surveying and related action regarding child supports and child conditions, employing, for example, the Search Institute's Developmental Assets Profile and Developmental Relationships Framework, possibly in combination with ACEs. There are many takeaways from this presentation, but here are some, and these may be particularly useful to you as you plan to make advances in your influences on interventions. State definitions of psychological maltreatment vary, which influences choices professionals have and creates needs and opportunities for improving a wide range of intervention approaches. Number 2, positive, respectful, reflective relational interventions in child caregiving represent the most promising intervention model for dealing with psychological maltreatment across all tiers. Number 3, a child rights informed public health and public health approach should be infused in all 3 intervention tiers: prevention, risk reduction, and correction or treatment. And of course, again, what is done in one tier should have relevance and be meaningfully supportive of interventions in other tiers. And now is the time to provide some initial answers to the question, what can you do? And let's be optimistic about this. There's always a way. When you look at particularly challenging circumstances, it's amazing what can be done, the route that can be found toward the goal that's desired. And here is your opportunity. Take time right now to identify the advances you consider needed and possible through your actions in your spheres of influence, and the most promising path toward that goal. Share your ideas with a colleague by describing your goal and path to seek perspective, advice, support, and cooperation as desired. Share your personal professional goal and intended path and act to realize your goal. Post a related message on the Psychological Maltreatment Alliance website. That would be great. And let us know if you need help. We appreciate your interest in child psychological maltreatment. We encourage you to visit the Psychological Maltreatment Alliance website location to access supportive references for this recorded webinar and a table which presents the psychological maltreatment definition and forms framework. If you'd like to explore possibilities for related research, policy, education and training, or interventions, please contact Leslie Schmerler at the Alliance or this program's presenters at one of the connection points provided here. We look forward to hearing from you.